Or standing in the open desert outside Luxor, midday, sun directly overhead, no shadow anywhere near you except the small dark circle collapsed underneath your own feet. The sand is hot enough to blister exposed skin within seconds of contact, hot enough that you can feel the heat radiating up through the soles of your shoes, even standing perfectly still in one spot. The air itself feels less like something you're breathing and more like something actively trying to cook you from the inside out, drying your throat before you've even had the chance to feel thirsty, pulling moisture out of your eyes until blinking starts to feel like genuine effort. Sweat evaporates off your skin so fast you barely register it happening at all, just a faint mineral crust building up where liquid used to be, a strange, dry residue left on skin that should, by any normal instinct you've ever trusted, feel completely soaked through. This exact environment, unmodified, unprotected, kills people quickly and without much warning. Not historically, not hypothetically, not as some abstract statistic from a history book gathering dust on a shelf. Right now in the modern era, with GPS, with bottled water, with breathable synthetic fabrics engineered by materials scientists in climate-controlled labs on the other side of the planet, tourists and hikers still die of heat stroke in exactly this kind of desert every single year, sometimes within a matter of hours of losing track of shade and water at the same time, sometimes within sight of a road. And yet for roughly 3,000 continuous years, spanning dynasties, wars, famines and floods, one of the most sophisticated, densely populated monument-building civilizations in all of human history thrived directly in this heat, farming it, building in it, raising children in it, burying pharaohs beneath it, with absolutely none of your modern gear, none of it, not a single piece, not one bottle of water engineered anywhere but the river itself. So how did they actually manage that, generation after generation, without a single piece of the technology you'd instinctively reach for if dropped into that same desert today? How does an entire civilization not just survive, but genuinely flourish, generation after generation for 3,000 years, in a climate capable of killing a healthy, well-hydrated modern adult in a single unprotected afternoon of exposure? It's not one clever trick, and it's definitely not simple toughness alone, though toughness certainly played some role in it, day after day, across countless ordinary lives that left no name behind in any record. It's a tightly interlocking stack of separate systems, biological, textile, architectural, and behavioral, all working together at once, each one covering for the weaknesses of the others in ways that only become obvious once you actually pull the whole system apart, piece by piece, and look at each component individually, on its own terms. Let's get into it. Ancient Egyptian civilization held together along the narrow, fertile ribbon of the Nile for something close to 3,000 years, through a climate where summer highs in Upper Egypt routinely climb past 40 degrees Celsius, well above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, with barely any humidity to soften the edge of it, and almost no rainfall worth mentioning across the entire year, sometimes going years at a stretch without a single meaningful drop. This wasn't a civilization that happened to exist despite the heat, tucked away into some cooler, more forgiving pocket of the landscape somewhere far from the sun. It was built directly inside one of the most punishing thermal environments any large human population has ever permanently settled in, and stayed settled in, continuously, generation after generation, for longer than most modern nations have even existed as a name on a map. Start with the part of this story that has nothing to do with clothing, architecture, or clever invention at all, because it was already sitting inside every single Egyptian before a single mudbrick ever got laid or a single loom ever got threaded. Paleoanthropologist Nina Jablonski at Penn State has spent much of her career studying how the human body itself evolved specifically for hot climates, long before Egypt, long before any civilization anywhere on Earth had a name. Humans carry an unusually high density of eccrine sweat glands spread across nearly the entire surface of the skin, millions of them, roughly 2 to 4 million, on an average adult body, a feature genuinely rare among mammals, most of which rely far more heavily on panting or simply avoiding activity entirely during the hottest parts of the day to manage their internal body heat. A dense covering of sweat glands allows for a remarkably efficient cooling method called evaporative cooling, where liquid sweat pulls heat directly off the skin's surface as it evaporates into dry surrounding air, a process that works dramatically better in low-humidity desert conditions like Egypt's than it would in a damp, humid jungle environment far to the south, where sweat simply sits on the skin, unable to evaporate quickly enough to actually carry meaningful heat away with it. Few other large mammals on Earth can sustain vigorous physical activity out in open, direct sunlight the way a human body genuinely can, a distinctly unusual evolutionary advantage that most people never stop to think about, having simply grown up taking it entirely for granted their whole lives. Jablonski's research also connects skin pigmentation directly to this same thermal story, arguing that darker skin, rich in a pigment called melanin, evolved specifically in populations living under intense equatorial and near-equatorial sun to protect the body against UV radiation damage and folate depletion, without interfering in any way with the sweat glands' ability to keep doing their job underneath it. The two systems, pigmentation for protection and sweating for cooling, evolved together, complementing each other rather than working against one another. In other words, before a single Egyptian ever wove a piece of linen or laid a single brick in the sun to dry, before any king ever ruled, before any pyramid ever rose out of the sand, the human body arriving in that landscape was already, quietly, one of the most heat-adapted mammals on the entire planet, purpose-built by hundreds of thousands of years of prior evolution on hot African savannas for exactly this kind of punishing, relentless sun. Which raises the next question, one worth pausing on for a moment. If the body itself was already this well suited to heat, evolved for it over hundreds of thousands of years, why bother building anything else on top of it at all? Because raw physiological tolerance, however impressive, only buys a person so much time before it runs out. Without support, that same efficient sweating system burns through the body's water reserves at an alarming, unsustainable rate under sustained desert conditions, and dehydration, not heat itself directly, is usually what actually kills a person stranded and exposed in a landscape like this one. A body can tolerate the temperature, it cannot tolerate running dry. Everything Egyptian civilization went on to build on top of that biological starting point was really aimed at one specific, unglamorous goal, stretching out the usefulness of that evaporative cooling system for as long as humanly possible, without draining the body dry in the process of doing its job. That's where clothing enters the picture, and it turns out ancient Egyptian dress wasn't simply a cultural preference or a matter of fashion. It was closely engineered thermal technology, arrived at gradually through centuries of accumulated trial and error passed down through generations of weavers. Textile historian Gillian Vogesang Eastwood, an expert on ancient Egyptian clothing who has examined preserved garments recovered directly from tombs, garments that have somehow survived for thousands of years in Egypt's extraordinarily dry conditions, has documented how nearly all everyday Egyptian clothing was made from linen, a fiber woven from the flax plant that grows unusually well along the Nile's fertile floodplain. Linen fibers are naturally hollow at the microscopic level and highly breathable, allowing air to circulate freely against the skin rather than trapping heat and moisture against the body the way a denser fabric like wool would. Beyond the fiber itself, the color mattered just as much, and this wasn't accidental either, more likely a preference refined generation after generation once people simply noticed which garments actually kept them measurably cooler on the very worst, most brutal days of the year. Egyptian linen was typically left in its natural, undyed, pale off-white state, or bleached further toward a bright white through repeated washing and sun exposure, a color choice that reflects a significant portion of incoming solar radiation back away from the body rather than absorbing it directly into the fabric, and from there, straight into the skin underneath. And the cut of the clothing mattered too, just as much as the color and the fiber. Garments were generally loose rather than tightly fitted, creating a thin layer of moving air trapped between fabric and skin, a small but genuinely effective buffer zone that both shaded the skin directly from the sun and gave sweat somewhere to actually evaporate into, rather than pressing uselessly against tight, damp fabric with nowhere for the moisture to go. Water itself, of course, sat underneath every single one of these adaptations as the one non-negotiable requirement none of the rest could function without, no matter how clever the clothing or the architecture built on top of it turned out to be. Nile's annual flood cycle, a predictable, near-miraculous seasonal inundation that ancient Egyptians structured their entire calendar and much of their religious life around, deposited fresh, fertile silt across the floodplain every single year without fail for millennia, enabling reliable agriculture and a stable food and water supply in a landscape that would otherwise have been almost entirely uninhabitable desert stretching out on either side of the river as far as anyone could walk. Without that water source anchoring everything else in place, no amount of clever clothing or clever architecture would have mattered even slightly, no matter how ingeniously designed. Every other adaptation described in this story only worked at all because the Nile itself made sustained, thriving human life in this heat genuinely possible in the first place. None of that alone explains how entire cities functioned, though housing tens of thousands of people at a time. This is where the story moves outward, away from the individual human body and into the wider built environment surrounding it. Archaeologist Barry Kemp at the University of Cambridge has spent decades excavating the ancient city of Amarna, one of the most extensively studied residential sites anywhere in Egypt, a city built quickly, occupied intensely for a relatively short period, and then abandoned, which left an unusually well-preserved snapshot of ordinary daily life behind for archaeologists to study centuries later. His work reveals a settlement quietly engineered, street by street, house by house, to fight the heat at an urban scale, not just a personal one. Streets in Amarna were often narrow and irregular rather than broad and straight, a layout that kept direct sunlight from ever reaching the ground level for very long stretches of the day, since the buildings on either side were constantly throwing shifting shade across the walking paths below as the sun moved overhead. The buildings themselves were typically constructed from mudbrick, a simple, locally abundant material made from Nile silt, chopped straw, and water, mixed together and dried directly in the sun rather than fired in a kiln, cheap enough that ordinary families could build and expand their own homes without specialized labor. Mudbrick carries an important thermal property called high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat slowly throughout the day and releases the stored heat slowly back out overnight, which keeps interior rooms noticeably cooler than the blazing exterior during peak daylight hours, and noticeably warmer than the rapidly cooling desert air once night finally falls and temperatures can drop sharply. Some structures excavated at Amarna and other Egyptian sites also show evidence of rooftop features believed to have functioned as early wind catchers, angled openings designed to catch and funnel any available breeze downward into the living space below, a low-tech but genuinely effective form of passive ventilation that required no fuel, no moving parts, and essentially no ongoing maintenance beyond the original construction effort. Many houses at Amarna were also built around a central open courtyard, a design choice that created a shaded, semi-enclosed outdoor space at the heart of the home, shielded on all sides by the surrounding rooms, where daily household activities like cooking and food preparation could happen away from both direct sun and the enclosed heat of the mudbrick rooms themselves, a small pocket of open air managed entirely by the shape of the building around it. So picture how all of this actually stacked together across one ordinary day in an Egyptian settlement, not as separate disconnected facts scattered across different fields of research, but as one continuous, coordinated system operating in the background of everyday life. Before dawn, while the desert air is still relatively cool, workers are already awake and moving, heading out to fields or construction sites to get the most physically demanding portion of their labor done before the sun climbs high enough to become genuinely dangerous to anyone caught out in it unprotected. At Deir el-Medina, the purpose-built village that housed the skilled laborers who carved and decorated royal tombs across the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists studying the site's remarkably detailed surviving administrative records, written on fragments of pottery and limestone called ostraka, thousands of them recovered from the site over decades of excavation, have documented a structured workday broken by a substantial midday rest period. Alongside a recorded pattern of scheduled days off, woven deliberately into the working calendar rather than granted haphazardly. Egyptologists studying these records have long connected that midday pause to the practical reality of the surrounding climate, a built-in retreat from the most dangerous hours of direct sun, timed to roughly the same hours modern heat safety guidelines still warn people away from unprotected outdoor exertion, thousands of years and an entirely different civilization apart, arriving independently at nearly the same practical conclusion. During that same stretch of the day, The thick mud brick walls of a typical home are quietly doing their slow, invisible work. Having spent the previous night radiating away the heat they'd absorbed the day before, arriving at midday still comparatively cool inside, offering genuine physical relief to anyone who steps in off the sun-blasted street outside. Loose white linen keeps direct sun off exposed skin while still allowing sweat to do its cooling job underneath, and any breeze the local terrain happens to offer that day gets funneled down through rooftop openings into the rooms below, adding one more small but meaningful layer of relief stacked on top of everything else already working quietly in the background. By late afternoon, as the sun finally starts losing some of its punishing intensity and the shadows begin stretching back out across the narrow streets, activity outdoors picks back up again, work resuming, streets filling with people again, daily life continuing on into the cooler evening hours, following a rhythm shaped, deliberately or not, entirely around the sun's punishing arc overhead, a rhythm repeated day after day, season after season. For centuries, without a single written manual ever needing to explain why. Here's the twist that reframes this entire story, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable one for anyone living comfortably in a modern, climate-controlled world. In a strange, very real, physiologically documented sense, many ordinary ancient Egyptians may have actually handled extreme heat better than most people alive today would, not because their bodies were fundamentally different from yours on some genetic level, but because of a specific, well-documented physiological process called heat acclimatization. When a human body gets exposed to consistent heat and physical exertion over repeated days and weeks, it undergoes measurable internal changes that a body living entirely in air conditioning never gets the chance to develop. Blood plasma volume increases, helping the cardiovascular system regulate internal temperature more efficiently under strain. Sweating starts earlier, at a lower core body temperature, rather than kicking in dangerously late once heat stress has already built up significantly. Sweat itself becomes more efficient too, carrying less of the body's precious sodium out with it, conserving electrolytes that would otherwise be lost and desperately needed. Exercise physiologists studying modern military training programs and elite endurance athletes preparing for competition in hot climates have confirmed this entire process repeatedly, under tightly controlled laboratory conditions, and deliberately induce it through structured, carefully monitored heat training, specifically because it provides such a significant, measurable protective advantage against heat-related illness and sudden physical collapse. An ancient Egyptian laborer, working outdoors under the sun nearly every single day of their life from early childhood onward, hauling stone, tending fields, walking between settlements, would have been almost permanently heat acclimatized in exactly this way, without any deliberate training program or scientific understanding of why it worked at all, simply as an unavoidable, automatic byproduct of ordinary daily life. Most people living in air-conditioned homes and offices today, by sharp contrast, spend the overwhelming majority of their waking hours inside artificially cooled environments, moving briefly between one climate-controlled space and another. And as a direct result, many modern populations have lost a significant portion of this natural acclimatization almost entirely, without ever realizing what they'd given up. This is a pattern researchers studying heat-related mortality during modern heat waves have repeatedly linked back to exactly this loss of everyday physiological adaptation, a genuine, measurable vulnerability quietly built into modern comfort. Which means, in a genuinely strange twist of history worth sitting with for a moment, a modern person mysteriously transporting into an ordinary Egyptian workday, wrapped head to toe in cutting-edge synthetic hiking gear, carrying a bottle of electrolyte powder and a wide-brimmed sun hat, might still be measurably more vulnerable to that same desert heat than the barefoot laborer working calmly beside them, someone whose only real technological advantages were loose white linen, a well-placed mud brick wall, and a body that had simply never once been given the chance to forget how to handle the sun. Now look at what that leaves you holding, standing in a modern city during the next serious heat wave, waiting for the air conditioning to click back on, checking your phone for the latest heat advisory warning you to stay indoors. The story of how ancient Egyptians survived the desert usually gets told as a story about their cleverness, and it certainly was clever, genuinely, remarkably so, a layered system of biology, textile engineering, urban planning, and daily rhythm that took centuries of accumulated trial and error to refine into something that simply worked quietly, without fanfare, for 3,000 years straight. But underneath the linen, underneath the mudbrick walls and the narrow shaded streets and the carefully timed workday, sits a quieter, more uncomfortable point about the world you actually live in right now. Modern civilization didn't necessarily make humans better at surviving heat. In many measurable, physiological, documented ways, it may have made a significant portion of us considerably worse at it, trading away a form of natural resilience your ancestors carried effortlessly, built into the rhythm of an ordinary working day, for the modern convenience of a thermostat mounted quietly on the wall. Consider what that trade actually looks like at scale, across an entire modern population rather than one individual case. Global heatwaves are growing more frequent and more intense nearly every year, driven by a changing climate, and the populations most at risk during them are disproportionately the ones spending nearly all of their time indoors, sealed away in air-conditioned comfort, cut off from the very heat exposure that would otherwise keep their bodies acclimatized and genuinely ready to handle a sudden spike in temperature. Public health researchers tracking heat-related deaths across modern cities have repeatedly found that vulnerability correlates less with raw physical fitness and more with recent heat exposure history, meaning the office worker who hasn't spent meaningful time outdoors in months can be at genuinely greater physiological risk during a sudden heat wave than an outdoor laborer working through it daily, even if that laborer is, by every conventional fitness measure available, considerably less healthy overall on paper. The body, it turns out, forgets far faster than most people assume it would, and modern comfort has been quietly teaching an entire species how to forget, one air-conditioned room at a time. You're standing in the open desert outside Luxor again, midday, sun directly overhead, no shadow anywhere near you except the small dark circle collapsed underneath your own feet, the same punishing light, the same dry, cooking air pulling moisture out of you with every passing minute. Only now you understand that the person standing here 3,000 years before you, in nothing but loose white linen, stepping in and out of a thick mud-brick doorway timed to the rhythm of the sun overhead, resting through the worst of the midday heat, as a matter of ordinary routine rather than modern luxury, might genuinely have had the advantage over you, not because they had better technology, and certainly not because their bodies were built any differently from yours at the level of raw biology, but because their entire life, every single ordinary day of it, had never once let them forget how to survive this heat in the first place.